Hello everybody, I am coming to you on Tuesday, or Wednesday rather, November, what is it, 19th. And I'm coming to you to give a bit of a review of sorts of a book that I recently completed reading. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus. By a new historiographical approach, and that is definitely a mouthful. That book, and I almost said a little book, it's not, it's over 600 pages, and if you don't count the appendices and the notes, is a book that a fellow by the name of Mike Licona, Licona, wrote as the thesis, or not the thesis, but the dissertation for his doctoral program. And so I just finished reading it. I got it last year, well, not last year, early this year in February. We went to an apologetics conference, and he was one of the speakers. He's a pretty well-known guy, teaches at the University of Houston, and is pretty known for his debates with Bart Ehrman and among others, defending the faith. And so, but he wrote this book when he was going through his doctoral program, and it escapes me right now which school he went to, but it was that was the purpose by which he wrote, or for which he wrote it. So, at the outset, I got to tell you, this book is not for everyone. Because as I mentioned, not only does it have 600 pages, but it contains a lot of information that's hostile to the whole resurrection idea. And that's not to say that the author is hostile to the resurrection idea, because he's not, obviously. But there's a lot of information in the book that he makes reference to that's hostile to the resurrection. And he does so in order to be able to say, okay, why, that the premise of the whole book is the resurrection, number one, historical, number two, is it factual, number three, is it believable, and number four, is it the best explanation for the empty tomb, basically. And so in doing that, he goes about telling a lot of points of view from people who are on the other side of the issue. In other words, who say, no, the resurrection is not any of those things, or at least not some of those things. So he has to quote from them, he has to set forth their ideas and their theories and their explanations for the empty tomb in order to refute them in the end. And the way he does that basically is just sort of saying, okay, these are the facts, the tomb was empty, these are some of the theories that have been put forth to try to explain how the tomb came about being empty, since Jesus was crucified, and that's a historical fact. So out of all of those explanations, out of all those theories, which one fits the facts the best? In his view, at the end, he determines, he concludes that the resurrection is the one that's the most the best explanation of the empty tomb. It is a very scholarly work, as I mentioned, a doctoral dissertation. This means that there's a lot of information in it that you're going to have to wade through in order to get to the meat of the work. And I say that because for about the first 450 pages, he goes on establishing his methodology, talking about historical horizons. And when I say historical horizons, what he's referring to is simply the idea that all historians have those horizons. In other words, by horizons, he's talking about just the ideas of a particular historian and his belief system, and how that shapes how he interprets the data. And so that, among other factors, among other entries, compose the bulk of the book, really, to tell you the truth. But at the end, of the book, you may wonder if the writer really believes the resurrection did take place or not. He does, but it seems like he leaves a few questions unanswered. And I think he does that because it's beyond the scope of his work to answer all the questions. He's committing himself or limiting himself to one particular question. Is the resurrection the best explanation for the empty tomb? His conclusion is that it is, but there are some other areas that sort of stay kind of up in the air, and you'll have to go to other works to have those answered, or hopefully from your own knowledge you can fill in the gaps, so to speak. It's going to, if you read this book, it's going to challenge what you think you know about the resurrection and about your faith as a whole. And that's part of that is, like I mentioned, there's a lot of hostile people being quoted, a lot of and when you read some of those things, at first glance you think, boy, that sounds pretty reasonable, even though it's completely contrary to the faith. Eventually you realize, well, it may sound reasonable, but the fact that it sounds reasonable doesn't make it so. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasonable ideas out there about a whole host of things. That doesn't mean that they're correct. So, but if you're not grounded in the faith, then it might set you to thinking a little too far off a field. So I'd say tread carefully, because it is rather, it contains a lot of information in it that's going to challenge you. And there's a lot of things that go against what we have been taught in a lot of instances. Some of it is nothing more than unbelief disguised as alternative doctrine. That's all it is. But a lot of it will also challenge some of the things that we believed for years. And they don't change, or at least I don't think, in my case it certainly didn't. It doesn't change my belief system or what I believe about Jesus, about Christianity, about the resurrection. But it certainly can change some of the peripheral ideas concerning your faith and Christianity in the first century and what it was all about. Because we like to think that we have all the answers, but there were a number of things that the early Christians did that later on were abandoned, really, and that have been modified to a certain extent. Again, we all like to think that, well, we go by the Bible and we do it exactly like the way the first century Christians did it. But if you study the history of Christianity, if you read the patristic writers and some of the other folks, you realize that, you know, there was a lot of things that they did that we don't do anymore. And a lot of those things, well, all of those things really, when you think about it, were just optional things. They were not things that were required in order for us to really be pleasing to God. But there are things that if we were to engage in them today, we would start saying, well, that's not biblical. And when in reality, it's just a little different than what we have come to understand, or we have misunderstood some of the passages in the scripture, thinking that they say one thing when in reality they're referring to something else. So, something to bear in mind if you ever decide you want to read the book. It's a good sign of what scholars do all day long, really. Some of the things you read in there and you're thinking, these folks just really don't have anything better to do. Because a lot of it is puffery, things that make absolutely no sense. And let me give you an example. For example, more than one of the scholars that are quoted that are hostile to the resurrection idea will tell you that, for example, when Paul saw the resurrected Christ, it was some sort of a hallucination because of his psyche. And one of them went so far as to say, well, he probably had Gentile friends when he was a child, and that influenced him. And when it came to Christianity, that sort of like made him think that, well, he saw the resurrected Christ and that now he needed to include all the Gentiles. It was no longer just a Jewish religion and so on and so forth. So in other words, stuff that not only is it just absolutely silly and senseless, but for which there's absolutely no evidence. And that's what a lot of people do. They pass things off as they pass off their opinions and their ideas that they come up with as evidence. And eventually, if they repeat them enough, a lot of people will start to latch onto them and will tell you that they're fact. A good example of that outside of the resurrection issue primarily is the deity of Christ. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, among others, will talk about how Constantine and the Council of Nicaea changed everything. Before that, Christ was not seen as God. And Constantine and the people at Nicaea basically put it in the Bible. And they changed a number of other things in the Bible as well. And like I said, there's absolutely no evidence for any of that. And as a matter of fact, the evidence to the when we talk about the deity of Christ is completely the opposite of what these folks are claiming. The evidence for not only biblical evidence, but the evidence of the patristic writers and of the writers long before Nicaea, refer to Christ as God. Nicaea simply established that fact and declared that, yes, this is the truth as taught in the Scriptures. That's all it did. It did not make it up and start inserting it into the Scriptures. I mean, think about it. You have thousands of manuscripts, and some of them were well beyond the control or even the knowledge of the people at Nicaea. So how in the world are they going to be able to gather all of those writings and put in it scriptures that will indicate that Christ is God? Imagine that. It's just silly on its face. And so that's why a lot of people, as I mentioned, they pass off these opinions and their particular doctrinal beliefs as true when they're nothing of the sort. The New Testament contains things that are hard to reconcile or understand. Let's face it. I mean, that's the reality of the matter. There's things in the Gospels, for example, that at first sight, at first glance, you think, well, these two things seem to indicate something different. For example, at the tomb, were they two women? Were there one? Were there two men talking to them? Was there one? Did the women leave and tell somebody about what they had seen? Did they tell no one? And I think that the problem is when folks begin to see that, they look at it at first glance and they don't realize that, number one, the writers had a different purpose for their writing. Secondly, they wrote to different audiences. And thirdly, you have to understand they're also writing from a different point of view. Some of them were eyewitnesses, others were not. They had to, some of them spoke with those who had been eyewitnesses, and so on and so forth. So it's not surprising that they have different views of the same event. But the fact of the matter is that it's the one event that they're describing. And that doesn't change. And I think that that's what gets lost in the shuffle of all these other issues. You can't lose your faith just because you may not have all the answers. We're never going to have all the answers until we get to the other side. And if God so chooses, He'll reveal to us why there are all these things that seem to be different. I mean, after all, that's what faith is all about. You have to fill in the gaps between what your mind can know and what God is telling you is true. Because those two things are not always going to be the same. Christianity is a reasonable, rational religion. But even then, it still has things that you have to accept by faith. There's just no way of getting around that. It is a faith-based religion. So don't be intimidated if you decide you want to read the book. I recommend it, really, because it's an exercise in thinking, no doubt about it. And as I mentioned, the individual is an apologist, and he's basically making an apologist for the resurrection and comes to the conclusion that the resurrection is the best explanation for the empty tomb. So there you have it. Next time I'll try to do a review of a website called infidels.org. I was going to do that one this time, but I wanted to go ahead and do the one for the book before a lot of the things that I read start to get a little fuzzy in my mind. So hope you've enjoyed this little review and that it will be useful to you. And until next time.